This land could be the jewel in the crown of Africa. But long chains of slavery and colonization brought this country to her knees.
The Congo is simply too rich to be left alone.
This land has seen the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human conscience.
Zaire is among America's oldest friends, and its president, President Mobutu, one of our most valued friends.
This land has to battle the ghost of a man who committed unspeakable crimes and turned this once paradise into a hellhole of torture, abuse, and murder.
So if you're going to ask about who was one of the most genocidal leaders in history, you'd say Hitler, right? Pol Pot. Did any of you guess King Leopold II of Belgium? Because we are only taught U.S. imperial history in schools, we here at Buzzsaw think it'd be a good idea to keep you informed of historical events and figures that may have been overlooked, censored, and forgotten in the whitewashing of our history. So today we bring you the story of King Leopold II of Belgium.
After the Conference of Berlin in 1885, Europeans embarked on a continent-wide land grab. In less than 20 years, 90% of African territory would be placed under European colonial rule. One of the main beneficiaries was King Leopold II of Belgium. Aware of the vast fortune to be made, he persuaded Europe's powers to recognize his sovereignty over one of Africa's largest regions, the Congo.
Here was this man who became King of Belgium in 1865 at the age of 30. Enormously shrewd, enormously greedy, enormously ambitious, and with an absolutely brilliant sense of public relations. He hired the explorer Henry Morton Stanley, the man who found Livingstone, to go to the Congo and essentially stake out this huge territory for him. Leopold got first the United States and then all the major nations of Western Europe to ratify his seizure of this enormous territory in the center of the continent.
First, Leopold created a smokescreen, claiming that he wished to educate a savage people.
They were all really fooled by Leopold because they took him at his word. They thought he was a man who's going to lose all his money in this crazy philanthropic venture. But they didn't realize what he was really after at all, which was to make himself hugely rich by exploiting brown hands and broad backs who were going to carry the wealth of Africa and load it on ships for his own personal profit.
They would go into village after village. The army would seize the women of the village and hold them hostage in order to force the men of each village to go into the forest and gather a monthly quota of wild rubber. And they did this for about 20 years. And you can just very easily imagine if you have a village where the women are all being held hostage, the men are all in the forest as forced laborers for several weeks out of each month. There's nobody to plant and harvest food, to go hunting, to go fishing, to do all the normal things through which a community feeds itself. So from all of these causes, starvation, being worked to death, and most of all from the disease that hit this famine-ridden population, the best estimates are that between 1880, when King Leopold first got his hands on the Congo, and 1920, that in that 40-year period, the population was slashed from about 20 million at the beginning of that period to around 10 million at the end. So an enormous loss of human life.
Although 10 million people died, the Congolese genocide has largely been forgotten in Europe. In the book The Heart of Darkness, the author Joseph Conrad, who witnessed the violence in the Congo, writes, "The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much."
They rape your women, they rape the kids, they morally control your mind.
There's a pattern to genocide. You can see it coming. I mean, it's like a hurricane.
Are we going to have to wait for 20 more years before somebody does something to stop this Holocaust?
There's a global consensus that exists that says it's okay for nearly 6 million black people to die in the heart of Africa and for us to be silent.
So I kept asking our intelligence people, is there any truth to this? I mean, what's happening out there?
I don't think policymakers could claim that they didn't know.
There's something wrong. There's something wrong with us in terms of the way we think about Africa.
You hear people being killed. The army is not an army.
But all this 125 years must be taken into consideration to fully understand why Congo is in a weakened state today. If we look from 1885 to 1908, we're talking about personal rule, enslavement. From 1908 to 1960, colonialism, Congo under colonial rule. Congo finally elects its leader in 1960, and in 61 was assassinated. So we have assassination. Then a dictator was put over the people for another 3 decades. So now we have dictatorship. Then an invasion was backed from outside with Rwanda and Uganda in 1996 that Congolese people suffer from to this day. So we have 125 years of this. Now what that does is it destroys and eviscerates the Congolese institutions.
Since 1996, hundreds of thousands of Congolese women and girls have been raped, and the violence is escalating. Their attackers are foreign or Congolese, the lines between them blurred by years of greed, chaos, and impunity. As the women are broken, so is the community, a war strategy that leaves tens of thousands of people dead every month.
They reduce you to a non-human, in essence. People are being reduced to a non-human so that they cannot think. They can feel powerless. They can feel hopeless, so they can give up.
It wasn't the Congo's inhabitants that made it that way. It was a ruthless succession of outsiders, beginning with Leopold II, a Belgian king with a lust for wealth and a passion for murder. He approached the Congo's tribal chiefs with land treaties and tricked over 500 of them into signing.
Obviously, they couldn't read, they didn't know what it meant, and they sold their birthrights for a few beads. It basically meant that they were handing over the rights to their land and the rights to trade, and they were handing that control over to King Leopold. Because what was extraordinary about the Congo was that it wasn't, at the beginning, a Belgian colony. It was essentially personal property of King Leopold II.
While Stanley was in Africa, gobbling up a region 80 times the size of Belgium, Leopold was back in Brussels figuring out how to make his gamble pay off. In 1879, Leopold created a private company whose stated mission was to free the Congolese people from foreign oppressors, namely Arab slave traders who were kidnapping native villagers and selling them into slavery abroad. Leopold assured the world his regime, which he called the Congo Free State, would bring prosperity and fair trade to the Congo. This, he said publicly, was the humanitarian thing to do, but his true goals were far different.
Well, he didn't believe in free trade. He didn't care at all for the indigenous population. He had absolutely no humanitarian ideals whatsoever. His aim was to create a colony for Belgium and make money.
In 1887, a discovery made half a world away would be Leopold's lucky break. Scotsman John Dunlop developed a useful and inexpensive way to revolutionize travel: rubber tires. The Congo was one of only a handful of places in the world where rubber grew wild, and Leopold acted quickly to exploit it. He formed the Force Publique, an army of Belgians and Africans, and got them to force Congolese natives into rubber harvesting. It was dangerous work and required scaling the tops of trees where the valuable vines hung. Leopold's rush to corner the world's rubber market led to a whole new form of slavery in the Congo, and a reign of terror so brutal it would become the worst genocide in African history. Meanwhile, inside the Congo, things went from bad to worse. When the rubber workers inevitably collapsed from exhaustion, starvation, or disease, the Force Publique shot them and were ordered to cut off their hands.
The Force Publique were issued with bullets, and the officers who were commanding these mercenaries wanted to see results. So for one of these soldiers not to get punished, if he was sent out with 10 cartridges, he had to have 10 hands of his victims. It's proof that he hadn't wasted his bullets.
By 1901, the Congo was one of the world's largest rubber suppliers, and King Leopold profited handsomely. He lived the high life in Belgium and in several chateaux and villas throughout Europe.
He was very adept at reading into the sort of boring statistics, how much was coming out of the Congo in terms of resources. He would get documents leaked to him by people within Leopold's administration, people who did have consciences, who were concerned at what was going on.
It was a moral issue, I think, for him. There was a robbery going on a grand scale.
He would bribe journalists, he would bribe US senators. He would invite people to go to the Congo and would make sure that while they were in the Congo, they only saw the nicest possible aspect of what was going on. So for every step that Morel took, King Leopold was up there meeting it and trying to neutralize it.
Paid for with riches looted from Congo. Magnificent buildings like the Africa Museum near Brussels can be seen all over Belgium. They bear witness to terrible times of colonial rule in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many Congolese are still appalled at the Belgians' cruel treatment of Africans. The wound is slow to heal.
Only after they left did we learn how we were sometimes treated, that they chopped the hands off many of us. During the colonial period, they kept that out of the public eye.
I miss Congo because I have family there. For their sake, I'd like to go back and see more of the country. And live there. Why not? That would be good.
Jacob Zuma, President of South Africa, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
I've heard you recently warning Western corporations of pursuing a colonial approach to Africa. What exactly does that mean?
Well, the colonial approach that we are talking about, as you know, Africa is the only continent in the world that was colonized by Europe, totally. We had to fight what we call the anti-colonial wars to free ourselves. And they were bitter wars. They were not just small wars, very bitter. When Africa became free, there was no arrangement how to make Africa develop. So they were left as they were. Up to this day, in some of the African countries, you still have the armies of the former colonial countries. What do they want there? You still have a mentality that they look at you as a former subject when they do business with you. And the fact that we have not shifted in terms of how the economic relations are, that's a bigger problem. The companies that dominate these countries come from the former colonial countries. In no way you have the indigenous companies growing to be in charge, so to speak. So that's a kind of relationship which is very skewed. It's not balanced. And there's been no effort to them who have the means to help balancing the relationship. That's what we are talking about.
There is also widespread belief that Europe, because it colonized Africa completely, like you said, at some point they just left Africa with disease and ruined economies, and they're morally indebted towards Africa, not only economically. Do you believe that also? Is Europe
of course,
indebted?
Yes, they messed up Africa. Not just they're indebted, they actually messed up Africa. They should have corrected their mistakes if they thought they committed some mistakes. In other countries, they did nothing. They did not development. But in the majority of cases, they sucked the wealth of that continent into their countries and made their countries rich and did not develop Africa. That's a reality. If things were equal, they would have said, look, let us do something to help these free Africans now to develop. They just abandoned Africa.
But what about China? Because everyone knows that China has a large appetite for African resources at this point. How do you make sure that they don't become the new colonialists of the 21st century?
They can't be. They can't be. China is not colonizing anyone. Europe held a conference to discuss how to colonize Africa, took a resolution collectively. China has not done so. They came to Africa not to do business. They came to Africa to colonize. That was their mission. China's mission is different. They're coming to do business in Africa. And I know that many people ask that question. China is doing business in Africa. I think it's going to depend on how Africa does business with China. That's the main thing. But you cannot equate the two. I think it's a wrong equation to say China is now coming to colonize Africa. Not at all. China has come to develop. It has brought better development in a short space of time than what the colonialists did in decades, if not centuries. This bank, even before it is finally established, already the African countries have engaged BRICS leadership to say this bank must be useful. So it's going to be user-friendly to the developing countries, very deliberately, so that it is helpful to develop the economy of the developing countries. And the kind of conditions that is going to put, they are not there now, but certainly there will be the conditions that help to get those countries that are in trouble out of those troubles.
Do I understand correctly that we're talking mainly about BRICS countries themselves and the countries that are surrounding them when we talk about...
No, we're talking about the bank that is going to deal with the developing world, so to speak.
All of the world.
It's not restricted to BRICS or to few countries around. All the countries that are developing countries. This, in other words, is a new bank that reflects the changed world that's going to be dealing with people differently from the banks that are dealing with the kind of thinking of the old world. So every country will benefit. There's no country that's not going to be. It's not done for BRICS only. BRICS does business with the developing world, of course with others. So because this bank is BRICS bank, it will be dealing with the countries that it deals with them.
Okay, Mr. President, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you very much.